The gray morning fog hovered low over Arlington National Cemetery, swallowing the endless rows of white headstones beneath a shroud of quiet reverence. Among the crowd of impeccably dressed officers and dignitaries, one figure blended seamlessly into the somber backdrop. An elderly man in a simple black suit, his shoulders slightly hunched, eyes scanning the procession with a stillness that went unnoticed. No one paused to meet his gaze. To them, he was just another face in the sea of mourners honoring General Robert Hayes. But Charlie Brennan wasn't just another mourner. He was a shadow from the past, a brother-in-arms who had walked the same perilous trails through the dense jungles of Vietnam alongside a young Lieutenant Bobby Hayes. While the crowd saw a decorated hero, Charlie remembered the scared boy who clutched a rifle and prayed for his men's survival amid the chaos of war. Their shared stories were etched not in medals or official records, but in scars and silent nods exchanged between men who had faced death together. What no one in the crowd could guess, and what the obituaries never told, was the secret that tethered Charlie to the man they mourned. For over 4 decades, every breath General Hayes drew was a borrowed one, owed to the vigilance and sacrifice of the old soldier standing quietly among them. It was a debt invisible to the world, a debt carried in silence and hidden beneath layers of military pomp and ceremony. Then, as the honor guard stood rigid, the colonel leading them, the general's own son, stepped forward and broke formation. In that single act, a wave of recognition swept through the crowd, shattering the illusion that rank and medals defined a man's true legacy. Because some bonds run deeper than ribbons and orders, some debts are paid in ways only brothers in arms can understand. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply moving story about brotherhood and recognition, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The morning fog hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, giving the rolling hills an ethereal quality that seemed fitting for a place where heroes rested. General Robert Hayes was being laid to rest with full military honors, a ceremony befitting his distinguished service and the respect he had earned over 3 decades of leadership. The guest list included the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and representatives from every branch of the military. Foreign attaches from allied nations had flown in specifically for the service. The media presence was substantial but respectful, documenting the passing of a man who had shaped military policy and strategy for a generation. Charlie Brennan had taken the metro from his small apartment in Alexandria, the same route he had traveled countless times over the years to visit other graves in this sacred place. At 71, he moved carefully but with purpose, his gait betraying the lingering effects of shrapnel wounds that had never quite healed properly. He wore his only good suit, purchased 15 years earlier for his wife's funeral, and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much but had never lost his sense of duty. He had learned about General Hayes' death from a brief mention in the Washington Post, buried on page 12 between an article about trade negotiations and a restaurant review. The obituary was comprehensive, listing Hayes' numerous assignments, his decorations, his role in modernizing military intelligence gathering. It mentioned his wife Patricia, his son Colonel Michael Hayes, and his 2 daughters. It detailed his service in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, his tenure at the Pentagon, his influence on strategic doctrine. What it didn't mention was Firebase Alpha, September 15, 1980, and the sergeant who had carried Lieutenant Hayes through 2 miles of hostile territory after their position was overrun. Charlie had tried to stay connected over the years, but military life had a way of scattering friendships across time zones and assignments. Christmas cards became sporadic, then stopped altogether. Phone calls grew less frequent as careers and families demanded attention. The last time Charlie had spoken to Bobby Hayes was 12 years ago, a brief conversation when Hayes had been promoted to his 3rd star. They had promised to get together, to catch up properly, but somehow the opportunity had never materialized. Now it was too late for catching up, but Charlie felt compelled to pay his respects. He owed Bobby that much, and more than he could ever repay. The ceremony at Arlington's Memorial Chapel was everything one would expect for a general's funeral. The honor guard stood at perfect attention, their movements precise and ceremonial. The flags were folded with crisp efficiency. The military band played hymns with solemn dignity. Colonel Michael Hayes, the general's son, led the honor guard with the same bearing and presence that had made his father a natural leader. Charlie found a spot near the back of the crowd, behind the official guests and invited dignitaries. He didn't try to move closer or draw attention to himself. He was content to observe from a distance, to say his private goodbye to a friend who had meant more to him than anyone in that crowd could possibly understand. The eulogies were formal and respectful, delivered by men who had served with General Hayes in various capacities throughout his career. They spoke of his strategic vision, his dedication to his soldiers, his role in shaping modern military doctrine. They mentioned his integrity, his leadership, his unwavering commitment to duty and country. Each speaker painted a picture of a man who had embodied the best qualities of military service. But Charlie knew a different Robert Hayes. He knew Bobby, the young lieutenant who had been terrified during his first combat patrol but had hidden his fear behind jokes and bravado. He knew the officer who had shared his rations with local children, who had written letters home for illiterate soldiers, who had carried pictures of his girlfriend Patricia in his helmet liner. He knew the man who had cried privately after losing his first soldier, who had blamed himself for every casualty under his command, who had aged 10 years in the span of a single tour. As the ceremony progressed, Charlie noticed Colonel Michael Hayes standing ramrod straight at the head of the honor guard. The family resemblance was unmistakable, the same strong jawline, the same penetrating eyes, the same natural bearing that commanded respect without demanding it. Charlie had never met the colonel, but he had heard Bobby talk about his son countless times during their brief conversations over the years. Michael had followed in his father's footsteps, making his own mark in the military, earning his own respect and recognition. The final phase of the ceremony began with the traditional rifle volley, 3 sharp cracks that echoed across the cemetery grounds. The honor guard began the flag-folding ritual, their movements precise and reverent. This was the moment when military funerals achieved their most solemn dignity, when the symbolism of service and sacrifice was most powerfully displayed. Colonel Hayes should have remained in formation, maintaining the ceremonial perfection that such occasions demanded. But as the flag was being folded, something caught his attention. A movement in the crowd, a face that seemed familiar, a figure that didn't quite belong among the officials and dignitaries. His eyes found Charlie Brennan standing quietly in the back of the assembly, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The colonel's training told him to maintain position, to preserve the dignity of the ceremony, to honor the protocols that governed such occasions. But something deeper, something that had nothing to do with military bearing, pulled him away from the formation. Without a word to his fellow honor guards, without regard for protocol or propriety, Colonel Michael Hayes stepped out of line. He walked directly through the crowd of mourners, past admirals and senators, past foreign dignitaries and Pentagon officials, his eyes locked on the elderly man in the ill-fitting black suit. The assembled crowd watched in confusion as the colonel approached Charlie, his movements purposeful but gentle. When he reached him, he did something that sent a ripple of shock through the formal gathering. He removed his white ceremonial gloves, the symbol of his role in the honor guard, and reached out to embrace the old man. "Uncle Charlie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion that had been building for years. "Dad talked about you every day for 40 years. Charlie felt his legs nearly give out as the colonel's arms wrapped around him. The embrace was tight, desperate, filled with decades of gratitude and recognition that had never been properly expressed. He had been Uncle Charlie to the Hayes children, though they had never met him. He had been a presence in their lives through their father's stories, a legend made real through countless dinner table conversations about Vietnam and brotherhood, and the men who had shaped their father's character. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the two men held each other, the polished colonel and the unrecognized veteran, bound together by bonds that transcended rank and ceremony. Whispers began to circulate through the assembly. Who was this man? Why had the colonel broken formation? What was the meaning of this unprecedented breach of protocol? Colonel Hayes pulled back slightly, his hands still on Charlie's shoulders, his eyes bright with tears he hadn't shed since childhood. He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery grounds despite its emotional tremor. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you about this man." He gestured toward Charlie, who stood uncomfortably as hundreds of eyes focused on him for the first time that day. This is Staff Sergeant Charles Brennan, United States Army, retired. He served with my father for 3 tours in Vietnam. The colonel paused, composing himself as he prepared to share a story that had shaped his entire understanding of heroism and sacrifice. On September 15, 1980, my father's firebase came under heavy attack. They were overrun, outnumbered, cut off from support. My father, then Lieutenant Hayes, was wounded by mortar fire, shrapnel in his leg and back that left him unable to walk. The position was being evacuated, but Dad was unconscious and too heavy for one man to carry alone. The crowd had fallen completely silent, drawn into a story that none of them had heard before, a chapter of General Hayes' service that had never appeared in his official biography. Sergeant Brennan could have evacuated with the others. He could have saved himself and left my father for the enemy to find. Instead, he stayed behind. He carried my unconscious father 2 miles through hostile territory, dodging patrols, hiding in drainage ditches, stopping every few hundred yards to check if Dad was still breathing. Colonel Hayes' voice grew stronger as he continued, the pride and gratitude evident in every word. It took him 8 hours to reach friendly lines. 8 hours of carrying a man who outweighed him by 30 pounds. 8 hours of risking his own life for an officer who couldn't even thank him. When they finally reached safety, Sergeant Brennan collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. He spent 3 days in the hospital, but he never complained, never asked for recognition, never made it about himself. The colonel turned back to Charlie, his voice softening with deep affection. My father always said he owed everything to Charlie. His life, obviously, but more than that. His career, his family, every moment of happiness he experienced after that day in Vietnam. Charlie isn't just a friend or a fellow veteran. He's the reason I exist. He's the reason my sisters exist. He's the reason our children will carry on the Hayes name. The impact of these words rippled through the crowd like a physical force. Admirals and generals who had known Robert Hayes for decades were hearing this story for the first time. They were learning that the man they had respected and admired owed his very existence to the unassuming elderly gentleman they had overlooked completely. Colonel Hayes reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Dad carried this with him for 43 years, he said, opening the box to reveal a Purple Heart medal. It was his Purple Heart, the one he received for the wounds he sustained that day. But he always said it belonged to Charlie, because Charlie was the one who truly bled for it. He held the medal out to Charlie, who stared at it with disbelief. Dad wanted you to have this. He tried to track you down for years, but you seemed to disappear after your discharge. He never stopped looking, never stopped talking about you, never stopped feeling grateful for what you did. Charlie's hands shook as he accepted the medal, the weight of it somehow containing all the years of unspoken gratitude, all the moments of recognition he had never received. Bobby always was too generous, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I just did what any soldier would do. No, Colonel Hayes said firmly. You did what a hero does. You saved a life, and in doing so, you saved all the lives that life would go on to touch. Every soldier my father led, every strategy he developed, every life he saved through his leadership, all of that exists because you carried him to safety in 1980. The formal structure of the funeral had been completely abandoned, but no one seemed to mind. This moment of recognition, this long overdue acknowledgement of heroism, had transformed the ceremony into something more powerful than protocol could ever achieve. General Patricia Hayes, the general's widow, made her way through the crowd to where Charlie stood. She embraced him warmly, tears streaming down her face. Charlie, Robert talked about you so often that I felt like I knew you. He always regretted losing touch with you. He would have been so happy to know you were here today. The ceremony concluded not with the planned precision of military protocol, but with something far more meaningful. Charlie was escorted to the front row, given the place of honor that should have been his from the beginning. The burial proceeded with him standing beside the Hayes family, recognized at last as the man who had made their existence possible. As the final prayers were said and the general was laid to rest, Charlie felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 43 years, he had lived with the memory of that night in Vietnam, the weight of carrying his wounded lieutenant, the fear that he might not make it to safety in time. He had never sought recognition or reward, but somewhere deep inside, he had wondered if it had mattered, if anyone remembered, if the sacrifice had been worth it. Now he knew. Not only had it mattered, but it had shaped the lives of people he had never met, creating ripples of impact that extended far beyond that single night in 1980. Robert Hayes had become a general, had led thousands of soldiers, had influenced military policy and strategy, had raised a family, and left a legacy of service and honor. All of that had been possible because Charlie Brennan had refused to leave a wounded comrade behind. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Charlie found himself surrounded by officers and officials who wanted to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to hear more about the man they had come to honor. But the moment that mattered most came when Colonel Hayes approached him one final time. "Uncle Charlie," he said, using the name that had made Charlie part of the Hayes family, even when they were strangers. "I hope you'll stay in touch with us. Dad would want you to be part of our lives, to know his grandchildren, to be the family member you've always been in spirit." Charlie nodded, overwhelmed by the invitation and the recognition that had come so late, but meant so much. "I'd like that, Michael. I'd like that very much." As Charlie rode the metro back to his small apartment that evening, he carried with him more than just a Purple Heart medal. He carried the knowledge that his service had been remembered, that his sacrifice had been honored, that the brotherhood forged in the fires of combat had endured across decades and generations. The story of Charlie Brennan and Robert Hayes would be retold many times in the years that followed, becoming part of the unofficial legend shared among soldiers about the bonds that transcend rank and time. But for Charlie, the most important part wasn't the recognition or the medal or even the ceremony itself. It was the embrace of a young colonel who called him Uncle Charlie, who had grown up hearing stories about the man who saved his father's life, who had broken military protocol to ensure that heroism was properly acknowledged. It was the knowledge that somewhere in the world, there were people who existed because of a choice he had made in a Vietnamese jungle 43 years ago. Sometimes recognition comes not from official channels or formal ceremonies, but from the hearts of those whose lives have been touched by quiet heroism. Sometimes the most important witnesses to our courage are the children and grandchildren of the people we saved, carrying forward stories of sacrifice and brotherhood that define the true meaning of service. And sometimes, a colonel breaking formation at his father's funeral is exactly what's needed to ensure that no hero goes unrecognized, that no act of courage is forgotten, that the bonds forged in combat remain unbroken across generations. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe it was a person who saved a life, changed a destiny, or made a sacrifice that rippled through generations without ever seeking credit. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their quiet heroism shaped the lives around them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.